Good morning and welcome back to the kelogsloops YouTube channel. So for today's video we're going to be doing part 2 of the wet on dry watercolor techniques tutorial. For those who haven't yet seen part 1, the link will be down below or in the card link just above over here. So let's get started. Today we're going to look at the last 4 techniques for wet on dry: pooling, feathering, splatters and drips. First off, let's look at pooling. Pooling is where you pull the applied paint from an area and spread or dilute it outwards, usually to create a blurred or gradient effect. Let's start off by doing a loose, blurred pooling effect. Begin by applying paint. Then clean your brush with clean water, and with the brush and paint still wet, we're going to lightly touch the painted area with the brush and apply an outward pooling motion like this. You can see that the initial painted area is still very coloured, while the pooled areas blend the pigment in a gradient. It's also a useful little trick if the painted area is too dark or coloured and you want to dilute it just a little bit. So let's try that again. Apply the paint, clean and wet the brush, pull outward and around, and just like that, we've created 2 blurred spots of paint, kind of like wet on wet bleeds. Another way you can use pooling is to only pool a specific part of a painted area, often to create very defined shapes. For this example, we'll make a flower. First off, I'm applying paint to mark the ends of the petals. Then, with a cleaned and wet brush, I'm going to pull inward from the painted area, like so. You can see the effect is a gradient going from the outer end of the petal to the inner part of the petal, dark to light respectively. This pooling method allows you to create defined shapes and crisp edges, but still using the same technique. And we're going to just try the same technique again. Here I'm applying paint again, and going ahead by pulling the paint with a wet, clean brush inward. And so I'm just going to repeat the same steps for the other petals, and there you have it, a flower. Pooling is a great technique for spreading patches of paint, sometimes to create a blurring effect similar to wet on wet bleeds, except with a lot more control. Pooling can also be used to create gradation from light to dark or vice versa in controlled shapes, like how we made that flower. The key things to understand and learn about pooling is to understand how paint moves with water. So by wetting the area around the paint and making contact with it, it allows the paint to bleed through to those areas. Remember, the paint will only travel to areas that are already wet. Another key thing to remember is controlling dilution. The more water you apply, the more opportunity for the bleeds to occur and the paint to actually spread. Now let's look at feathering. Feathering is a very similar technique to pooling, but with a bit more of a subtle and controlled blur. Start off by applying paint. For this example, I want to create blurred lines. With the paint still wet, clean and load your brush with water. Then apply a stroke alongside the painted area carefully, gently touching or overlapping the wet paint with the tip of the brush. As the paint makes contact with the newly wet surface, it allows the paint to bleed into that area, creating that blurred line you see here. Let's try that again, but less subtly. Apply the paint, wet the brush, and this time we're going to overlap into the paint a bit more, like this. Immediately you can see the feathering effect is much more dramatic, and this is because the more wet the area you create, the more dramatic the effect. So let's try feathering again, but this time with colours instead of clean water. First off, I'm going to apply a diluted streak of red, and then with the red streak still wet, I'm going to apply a diluted streak of blue. Beside that, a very pigmented streak of red, lightly touching that wet blue streak. And I'm just repeating this step again and again with blue and another red. Just like before, you can see the feathering effect take place, but instead of a gradated blur to white, we're seeing a transition from blue to red. And especially with the bolder, more pigmented strokes, you can really see the feathering and bleeding of colours into one another. Pretty cool, hey? In summary, feathering is a great technique for creating a blurred effect on edges or lines. And for example, if you want to create something that is maybe out of focus, or for subject matter that doesn't have those sharp, crisp edges like clouds. The key things to learn and understand about feathering is just like pooling. It's about understanding how paint moves with water and controlling dilutions. Next up, splatters. These are probably the most fun of all watercolor techniques, and also one that I get asked about quite often. First, we're going to apply a paint. Depending on how much you want the paint to spread or how dramatic the effect, apply more or less. The more generous, obviously, the more dramatic and explosive. With the paint still wet, place your face in the direction you want the paint to splatter, and blow. The stronger you blow, the further the splatter. Let's try that again. Apply the paint, aim the splatter, and blow. It's a simple little technique, but does take a bit of practice to get control of. Just remember to experiment and keep practicing. Now we can try doing some experimental splatters, this time with a straw. Same process, we're going to apply the paint, and this time, using a straw, we're going to blow at the puddle of paint, like this. This technique helps a lot in having more control over where the splatters go, as you can literally point to where the air will hit the puddle. You can even splatter the splatters if the paint is still wet, like this. You end up creating these cool little chain effects, and you can just keep experimenting. Let's get even more experimental and create multiple puddles of paint, like this. And again, same process with the straw, we aim, blow, and BAM! How cool is that? Another way to create splatter effects is by using the brush itself. First, you want to load your brush with paint generously. Again, the more paint, the more dramatic the effect. Aim your brush over the paper and tap onto the handle of the brush to flick paint and get those awesome splatters. Another way to create splatters is to do it flicking the bristles of the brush itself. So let's try that. First, load the brush with paint generously and aim the brush over the paper, and this time, using your finger, bend the hairs of the brush backward and release. This little flicking technique makes the splatters a lot smaller, but they go everywhere, which is maybe your intention. You can even do this with a toothbrush. Splatters are a real fun technique that can be used to create awesome effects in watercolor. They're great for creating raw, expressive aesthetics within a piece, and often creating visual interest, as it's a technique almost exclusive to watercolor. A key thing to remember with splatters is control. Splatters might seem chaotic, but you can control them by changing the angle you blow, the strength at which you blow, and even how much paint you apply or how hard you flick. And the last technique we're going to look at today is drips. Drips are a fun little technique where the paint drips off painted areas, sometimes even off the page itself for a cool little effect. To do this, first you'll need to apply the paint in the area you want the paint to drip from. I want the paint to drip from the top, so I apply it like so. Then while the paint is still wet, I lift the page up on an angle and continually load my brush with water and paint and apply it to the painted area. You can see that doing this creates a bead of paint, which gradually grows bigger and bigger until it becomes too heavy and drips off the page, like this. Let's try that again. Again, I'm going to apply paint to the area I want the drip to start from, and then continually load and apply paint and water to the area with the paper tilted until the bead drips off the page. While the paint is still wet, you can even get a bit experimental and add some extra color to drip down, like this. Drips are a fun little experimental technique that can often make your watercolor paintings look a bit more expressive and spontaneous. They're another great way of really showcasing the unique properties of watercolor. The key thing to practice here is the beading of the drop. Be patient and experiment with different methods of loading the drop, maybe even using a dropper. And that sums up the beginner's watercolor wet on dry techniques. Remember, you don't have to use all of these techniques. They're just here to show you all a foundation of techniques that you can use and maybe incorporate into your own style. Maybe you really like splatters, or maybe you really like feathered edges. Try experiment with the techniques and see what works best for you. Even better, try develop your own unique technique. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video and maybe learnt a thing or two. I will be doing more tutorials like this, so keep an eye out on the channel and we'll see you soon.